relocate 8,500 jobs to Nashville. And so Marshall spoke with a Nashville business journal, right, Marshall?
Yes, they called me all frantic, acting like we really need, I mean, they were blowing up my phone. No, I'm just messing. No, Mark just reached out and just see if I had any comments to it. I didn't even see the article at first. I mean, yesterday was a crazy day. So I had to pull on the side of the road, read the article, and then respond to him. So
Well, it represented well, I think, the fact that, we want Nashville to grow and evolve, but I thought the way you framed, investment in current residents obviously is a priority for all of us, especially in that location. There's a lot of opportunity to make that space really dynamic, and we also know the surrounding areas are a bit fragile in terms of housing stability. So
that's right.
All right, Mick, how are we looking on attendance?
We're looking pretty good. We're looking pretty good, I think. Yeah, I think
Wonderful.
we're about ready to get started.
Okay. And Dontre, if I can have the share capacity, I'll go ahead and share our agenda for review here today. Thank you so much. I hope everyone received the agenda yesterday. This is going to be our second to last meeting. So today is April 15th. We'll have our subcommittee meetings. That's what we're here today to do, is our last chance to meet in a small group. And the purpose of this was to make sure we had a small group session to review the work that was done at the in-person last week, and then to talk about the values that we want to share with the city and with the mayor in the report. And then next week, I'll send out a calendar invite, but mark your calendars. We will have the full task force together at 5 p.m. That will be our final meeting, and that will be a chance to sort of review the report and sign off. And we're hoping the mayor can pop in and say thank you, but it is also State of Metro season, so that's TBD. And then we will get to work on this. So of course, it's not really the end as much as it's the beginning of implementing all of this. And I know everyone is committed to the long-term work here. I want to go ahead and give a overview of the report outline. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. So yesterday in our subcommittee co-chairs and with Mick and Ed, we went through a report outline and tried to sort of come up with a cohesive narrative for how the report will represent the work that you all have done. So this was a reflection of the discussion yesterday. And one thing that Kia Jarman, the creation subcommittee co-chair, said, let's make sure that this sets the tone for a new opportunity, that it's a call to action for people who want to engage in affordable housing. It's a directive for people who have been in this space for a long time, and it provides some cohesion for where we're headed so we can all row in the same direction, as it were. So first we'll have a letter from the mayor, sort of, thanking everyone for this work and endorsing, the process and the recommendations. And then Ed and Mick are working on a letter as well to try to represent what you all have done and sort of create a call to action as well for anyone who was not involved in the task force, but is certainly part of this work or wants to join in this work. And then we want to do an overview of the process. This was something that came out of the discussion yesterday, was to try to orient folks who might sort of be wondering, what is this report? How does it fit in with the 2017 housing report and Nashville Next? And so referencing those past reports, we can hyperlink to them. We can showcase that work and show that this is not a starting at ground zero, which I know was shared with you all in the initial request to be part of this task force, is that this wasn't, you know, a reinvention of the wheel. We're acknowledging that there's already been work that's been done, and we had sort of clear objectives about wanting to identify what we could do in the near term to make significant progress, and then build momentum for our long term. And then also showcasing the community engagement that has been done in the past, and that this will be an ongoing process of community engagement, both with the recommendations and how they're implemented, and then being able to sort of monitor their effectiveness and how they need to be adjusted. And then talking about the history of housing, you know, redlining, sharing the map of the redlining that was done in Davidson County, and then being able to showcase why racial equity is an important value for this, and looking at the ways that we implement our tools. And then today we'll have the discussion on values, and this is intended sort of to take our high-level goal of housing for all and our recommendations, which are very tactical, and be able to set some tone language for values. So sort of an in-between of that big goal, where we're headed, and the day-to-day, what are we here to do and how do we want to do it? So there's a few things that I know I've heard in our conversations, but I also want to make sure we have time to discuss today. And then setting a goal and impact statement, which I will have Mick share a bit about, as he was really helpful in that discussion in our in-person. Was we know that the 31,000 unit deficit looms large in a lot of people's minds, and we want to make sure that we have measurable goals for ourselves. So not only sharing, you know, what's the unit count that we're headed to, but sort of what's the impact when we are able to have accessible housing options. So we want to make sure that people understand what we're headed toward. Ideally, that, you know, we want to have vibrant communities where people can afford to live, and they are adjacent to assets that, you know, help them build their families and their neighborhoods. So, and then we will have the recommendations and the data. So one question that we had about the data was where to place that. In part, you know, you don't want to lose people in the graphs at the beginning, but we did want to showcase that we had great data analysis provided by Greg and the planning team. So we will be including a couple of data statements at the top to sort of say, you know, here's what we used in order to set our goals, and then the remainder of the graphs and everything will be at the end. So that was the way to sort of bridge that, wanting to showcase that we use data, but not wanting to front load it in a way that can lose people. So really want to, you know, anchor the report in our values and how that informed our goals and recommendations, but also, of course, the data that we will use to measure ourselves. So that is the outline. I do want to open it up for feedback on that outline from folks, and if there's not feedback, then Mick can walk us through the recommendations for the in-person and how we arrived at those last week. Anyone see anything that's missing? And I will say these are, you know, obviously the headers of the various sections, so they will be fleshed out. I have the notes from our discussion yesterday on obviously what will be included, but if you think that there's something that, you know, oh, this is the question that I've heard consistently from the public, let's make sure we reference it, or anything to that effect. From a design perspective, we're using RJ Young, who has a contract with Metro already, so they'll be helping make sure it's you know, pretty and user-friendly and represents our work and not too text-heavy. And also for the digital version, looking to hyperlink to the actual past reports as well, so the document can be dynamic in saying, you know, if you're brand new to affordable housing, here's a great 101 that will familiarize you with the terms. If you want to learn more about the EPS study, here's the link to that. You can go dig into that. That way we don't weigh the report down too much with a retreading of work that's already represented well in other reports.
Is there going to be a glossary of terms that, because you're talking about somebody who's new, so is there going to be a glossary of terms like when you're using low-income housing tax credits or, you know, the acronyms for that? Is there going to be a glossary that spells some of the things, some of those out?
I will welcome Ed and Mick to speak to that, but that is something that I have heard from people that we want to do. I also was talking with Kelsey, the 101 that she did with the Civic Design Center does a good job of outlining those. So, you know, I welcome your guys' input if you think we should just hyperlink to that report. But the problem, of course, is that if we're using a paper copy, we would want to identify some of the basic ones, and I think it's simple to include that as an appendice as well. Would you recommend that, Marshall?
Oh, I thought you were talking to Ed and Mick. I thought they were going to answer.
Sorry.
Yeah, you know what? I just know that a lot of times we know the language where we're talking and how when we're talking to each other, but someone when we're talking, you know, to Oracle or to Amazon or to whoever, sometimes we have to spell that out of what that means at times. So if somebody gets this report, you know, I just think it's a good idea for if we are referencing to the 101 or other areas, I think is necessary and important.
I agree 100%, Marshall. It's really important for the lay people to understand the terms.
Okay, great. I've taken that note down, and we'll make sure that those are included. And just, I think, you know, it can be hard to have a report like this to be clear on the audience. So I do want to set the, you know, that this audience, it might not be totally, you know, you could hand this out at any neighborhood association and people would totally understand it. But I think the more that we can have an on-ramp to say, you know, here's the basic terminology, you could read this and be able to orient yourself. And if you want to go back and read through, you know, all of what got us here, here's these other links. So trying to find that balance, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay. Any other feedback on this outline? Otherwise, we'll move into the recommendations. Council member? You're on mute.
Thank you. Right now, the recommendations are kind of low on the list and they're in amongst a bunch of other things. Will that end up being the bulk of the report, or is that just going to end up being one page of bullet points?
Good question. Mick, you can of course speak to this as well, but that's a good, the process values and goal and impact statement, I anticipate being, you know, 1 to 3 pages with the bulk of the report being the recommendations.
Right. Okay.
And then we will split up sort of the high impact recommendations, which we identified at the planning session and through your survey results. And then, you know, here's everything else. So, and we'll find language to help sort of outline the process that helped us reach those 2 tiers. But the first 5 bullets you see here would probably be, you know, the first 25% of the report in terms of page count within the recommendations, and then the graphs being the remainder.
Gotcha. And are we planning on a 1-page executive summary at the front? Because certainly when I get handed a large report, some days all I get to is a 1-page executive summary. Is this big enough to warrant that or not, do we think?
I'll turn to our academic, Mick.
I'm a retired academic. But yes, the way that I would approach this is we want this as few, my goal, this is my personal, we'll sort of see how it rounds out, as fewer pages as possible for the total report while communicating everything that needs to be communicated. There's 2 statements that totally work against each other. I acknowledge that. If it does get to that point of some critical mass of pages, maybe it's somewhere over 5 or 7, then I do think some of it may be captured. We may be the letter from the mayor, perhaps, or the letter from the co-chairs can sort of function potentially as that executive summary. But I'd like to sort of see how it all comes together and sort of say, hey, actually, we really need an executive summary, or actually, we've been so succinct throughout the report that someone can flip through it and get to what they need to get to the meat of it very quickly. So I think if it gets beyond a certain length, then we certainly do need an executive summary, would be my very gray answer to your very black and white question. So I'm not a completely retired academic, I should say.
That's helpful, Council Lady, though, because I think it would be hard to sort of summarize it, because of course we want the values to be represented, we want the data points, but my hope is that those first sort of 3 or 4 pages with the values, the goal, and the recommendations could act as, if you just read these few pages, you'll understand the data that informed this, the values that informed this, and what we're hoping to accomplish in the next 3 years. Other feedback? Okay. Mick, do you want to go into our high impact recommendations?
I would love to. So we had a great time last Wednesday discussing the survey results. I think you all saw the initial breakdown of an Excel tabulations that I did from the survey results. And what you may have noticed when you were filling out the survey like I did, and I think that some of you may have noticed as well, that we had some interrelated recommendations. And one thing that I was conscious of not wanting us to do is have some things that are very closely related split the vote in a sense. So we had something about we should have a dedicated fund to purchase a strike fund to purchase at-risk affordable housing. And then we have another one saying that Metro should invest more resources to have money available to preserve expiring affordable housing. Very similar, but slightly distinct. That's not a great representation of the two questions, but they were along those lines, and there was a few different ones. So what I went ahead and did was go and sort of put together what were common categories: increasing city funding, better use of Metro land, payment in lieu of taxes policy, things around data and tracking, things around zoning, things about housing choice vouchers, things around having a Department of Housing, and so on and so forth, and categorize them, and then ordered them sort of which one had the most kinds of folks from the committee in the survey sort of saying, hey, this is either a high or medium priority. So that was the starting of the process, was categorizing, and then grouping to sort of the highest impact things that were, or the things that were, the themes that were related scored sort of the highest impact. So then this is the summary of those kinds of results in that discussion that we had last Wednesday. The highest priority thing that came out of the survey was strengthening and investing in the Barnes Fund. We had two specific questions, one in preservation, one in the subcommittee, one in creation committee, was around dedicating $30 million a year towards the Barnes Fund, and that was sort of the headline from our survey results. So that's where that one is. We had, as I was running through this a second ago, I mentioned that we had some things around data and tracking. Another thing about having a Department of Housing. In our discussions, we realized, hey, they probably go hand in hand. Having the city knowing what's going on and having staff to do something about it. And so we sort of, what I thought of distinct categories, when the group was all talking about it, we realized that was all put together. So that's the sort of department and data. The next highest priority that came out of the survey was having this dedicated fund to preserve affordable housing. And whether that's currently subsidized, maybe expiring, or maybe converting to market, or something that's more naturally occurring. Having some city resources in the city dedicated to that was something that came up again and again from the survey results. Maybe I'll halt here. We'll just run through. I think we've got, what, 8 of them. Or any questions? I'll pause here for a second to see if there's any questions so far. I see John's hands up.
Thanks. So on the Barnes Fund, I'm loving the way this is unfolding, by the way. So I'm asking the question in that spirit. The 2 key things besides that we want to put more money in this Barnes Fund is this notion of reliability and enable the developers, particularly the not-for-profits, to plan, year over year over year. And so the concept of a rolling 3-year commitment to the Barnes Fund that would give visibility into years 1, 2, and 3 going forward is an important element. And you get at that when you say the word reliable. I wonder if the 3-year concept was discussed as an important element of this, that, the definition of reliable is 3 years of visibility versus 1 year versus 10.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, you're absolutely right. There's no point. Yeah, let me sort of, way I think about this is, these are our recommendations, and they're not just for next year. This is for, this is for the next 3 to 4 years, our recommendations, and that this would be it. And I think you're right. We should make that explicit and point out the fact that you can't just make money available tomorrow and expect to get really good proposals. If people have lead time to put together projects, that's going to be really important. So yeah, maybe we can even strengthen that language a little bit.
I think there's an opportunity to get that, a little bit fine-tuned in that regard. And this concept of a rolling 3-year, I think, is powerful. I'm all for 30, 40, or 50 million, but the truth of the matter is, if we had 20 and we knew for certain it was going to happen for the next 3 years, then we that would be almost more important than having 30 in 1 year.
Yeah, agree. I guess my only hesitation at 3 years is because I want it to be indefinite.
Yeah,
but I think you're right. And that's
you say at least.
Yeah. Every year is another 3-year commitment into the future.
That's rolling 3-year gets you that, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what the point you're making, which we're laughing, but it's very important.
Mm-hmm. Councilmember Allen.
Oops, sorry. I just added language
question
there, John, but I'll try to keep wordsmithing that to get that point.
Will we ultimately be adding the subcategories that stood out the most in each of these high impact recommendations? Each of those sort of pulled 4 or 5 things together that were slightly different version, variations on the theme. Will there be like sub bullets where those will be spelled out, or is what we're seeing what's going to be what shows up in the report?
Hannah, do you have thoughts? I've got some thoughts, but do you want to go first?
Yeah, I will just say, I know we had promised that all recommendations would be reflected in the report. So the smallest liberties, so we're not completely duplicating things since we're merging from the 2 subcommittees. So nothing obviously content oriented, but if there's ones that are, at 1 degree of separation, I'll combine those just so the report obviously reflects the level of professionalism we had. But yes, so my sort of view on how this would flow would be the high impact recommendations, these 8, and then breakdown underneath that would include the sub recommendations, basically, so that especially in terms of what you're saying, people get the high level, but then they also get the specifics.
Yeah. I don't want to. Should we? Let's keep on moving, Hannah. I think our values discussion is going to be really important. As we draft this, we'll share with you. I think everyone will have a chance to have feedback on it. as we keep on moving. But this is a great conversation, but I also don't want to miss out on our conversation further about values here in a second. So the next 3 items that came up was just basically being really strategic about utilizing the land resources Metro already has. So if we're building a new building, city's building a new building in a place, it'd be great to have some more housing units. Can we put more housing units on top of them? You know, we will see that there's a bunch of different recommendations here. Maybe RFPs for land that is really focused on creating affordable housing on that. And so, and then also another thing that came out of the survey results around that is maybe strategic acquisitions that Metro could make around areas that they may be planning investments already. Another question in the survey recommendation was in there was about about River North and places like that. We know that there's going to be big things happening there. City's going to invest. Can there be some strategic acquisitions around those types of investments that the city could make, or an arm of the city could make that could be set aside for housing affordability? So just basically being Metro, think about, do a great job with the public lands that you already own, and think about where you might be making future investments and controlling land around those so that we can make sure that there's housing for all associated with these big ticket items. Is there, and you see the summary on the page there that probably is much more articulate than I am. Another thing that's come out for the last 3 months or so is what's going on at the state level. And so this is how we kind of summarize that, which was, I'm just going to read this one word for word: identify and collaborate with regional and statewide allies to build support for better integration with local priorities. Find ways to partner with the state more effectively, including, this is one focus thing, which might be a relatively low-hanging fruit as it comes to state policy, is take what used to be dedicated to what was called the House program, which was a statewide housing trust fund. A portion of the real estate transfer tax was going there. Under Sundquist, it got redirected back to the general fund. Doesn't seem like it would be a huge lift for the governor to redirect that back towards a statewide housing trust fund. So that's what's referred to there in the parentheses, but basically saying, hey, if Metro wants to have an impact in collaborating with the state, we probably need to increase the size of our tent in that conversation with the state. And we know that there's folks working on that now, and Metro needs to be more active in that regard in order to get what we want and have more success there. When it comes to the next one is pilots, and there's improving the existing payment in lieu of taxes for LIHTC developments, as well as opening up a new form of payment in lieu of taxes for non-LIHTC developments that would also sort of incentivize the development of affordable housing. And this is one that's, is nice and specifically focused for not just not-for-profits, but also for-profit developers. This is something that they could utilize. Hannah, should we jump onto the next page? Oh, John, yes.
But when you guys talk through the state policy, it seems like the 2 other big issues besides the transfer tax is a good one, but is the inclusionary zoning issue and the forbidden rent control provisions in state law. Is it worthwhile, or did you consider naming them as goals? Obviously going to be very challenging, in our supermajority legislature to get that done next year. But in terms of, as we talk to our colleagues around the state who are concerned about the impact of state on housing, those 2 issues plus the dedicated source of funds are really the 3 big deals. Wondering how that conversation went on Wednesday.
Absolutely. And part of it is the focus, I think, twisting the focus to being like, okay, what does a group of stakeholders across the state really care about that's going to help housing affordability both in Davidson County and throughout? And if those are the three things, then those are the three things. But starting from, instead of starting from maybe a particular issue, the idea was maybe start from, okay, what is something that is actually going to be able to be changed? As you point out, a supermajority that is anti-inclusionary zoning is going to be really hard to change unless we start to find members of that supermajority who actually become supportive of this as it stands. So I think the thought was, as we discussed it, and this wasn't an explicit conversation, this is me sort of reiterating it, sort of putting it back together. But the idea was, okay, let's start with working with others and figuring out, okay, what can be done then? Because we know right now the situation is far, the collaboration, frame it this way, the collaboration between Metro Nashville and the state of Tennessee when it comes to housing policy falls far short of where we'd like it to be.
And those specific recommendations still will be in the report called out. So sort of to Berkeley's earlier question, the specific ones will fall below without, you know, getting into too much of the nitty gritty in each of the high levels.
That's great to hear.
Any other thoughts on this page?
And I just wanted
Angie,
to build on what Mick was explaining. You know, as we discussed the high impact recommendations, one of our directives from the beginning is what's realistic, and that's where it's most realistic for us to have these changes at the legislative level when we start with this coalition building with those commonalities of housing issues that we can start addressing now, knowing that there are bigger issues that we need to tackle. But again, it was through that whole context of what can we do in these initial years to accomplish some changes.
Thanks, Angie. All right, seeing no other hands on this one, our last two.
Yeah, so just quickly, we had a bunch of recommendations that all related to land use policy across the city. And basically this is something we struggled with, how to be both not too vague, but also nice and capture everything. So we sort of came around to sort of draft wording along the lines of reduce barriers to developing strategic and appropriate density. And this is where, you know, we can, maybe the report can lean into making a stronger case within its language around this, because the audience here is interesting. It's both Metro and the mayor himself, but it's also our planning commissioners, as well as our council members who have a huge degree of influence over zoning decisions, as well as our neighborhoods and communities. And so this is a conversation that involves a lot of different stakeholders. And so this may be a part of the report. I think, Angie, I'll let you jump in here too, that we think, you know, we should maybe lean in. The other ones may be a little bit more straightforward. There's one person or two people that can really take a ball and run with it. This one involves the whole city, in a sense, to buy it.
Sorry, trying to get off of unmute, but yes, you're right, Mick. This is there are key players that can make enact decisions, but for them to be able to enact those decisions, they've got to have deep support from neighbors and neighborhoods and community groups. And so that's where this one, when we were talking about it, was almost the hardest one to narrow down the language of exactly what we wanted to get at and how we could. But yeah, this one is all hands on deck.
And then the final one, it was sort of the opposite of the zoning one. The zoning issues, land use issues came up in a number of different people's priorities and a number of different recommendations. There was, I think, just one in the preservation committee and one in the creation committee around Metro supporting the MDHA envision process. And that sort of was sort of the last sort of major one that rose to the top as far as the survey results come from, as the sort of highest impact recommendations based on what everybody who filled out the survey sort of came to. And then support for that, because those locations are already under control by an owner who really cares about affordable housing and wants to make mixed income, mixed use, thriving communities. So this seems to me to be like a nice, great, high impact, and supporting that. And it came out of the survey as a great avenue potentially to achieve our shared goals.
It sounds like there were some really smart members of this task force, Mick. I mean, just as an impartial observer to the process, these sound like brilliant people providing insights. It's encouraging to hear. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah. Well, I agree.
I think you guys have really nailed it here. I mean, this is a very well distilled list. You can always talk about tweaking around the edges, but I think the group collectively in the process resulting in these recommendations is where we need to be.
And thank you both. And I think where we'll go from here as part of the report is, okay, what's the targeted cost? What's the timeline for implementation for each one of these ones? And what are going to be the units that result from each of these things? So we may have like a page or whatever that just has these general ones, and then broken down in more tabular form, and then broken down to those sub recommendations that Councilmember Allen was talking about and what we've all talked about and came up and seen as important. So we'll have sort of a nested conceptualization of the recommendations, which also associate also potentially, I believe we're thinking about having, okay, who is the lead on making these things happen? So some of which may be, the mayor's office specifically, some may be other folks, other stakeholders would be the appropriate folks to take the lead on that. And we hope to have a report that sort of identifies that in order for next steps to happen. And I think we've touched on this, and this might be a nice segue if everyone is comfortable with that. These are sort of more leaning towards practical considerations on what should be done. What it doesn't necessarily, what it kind of leaves out is some of the sort of perhaps overarching values that this committee cares about, and what should inform all of our actions when it relates to these 7 or 8 general recommendations. And so I don't know who's going to lead the sort of values discussion, but I believe, if I remember correctly, that's what next on our agenda. So I'm going to try and make the segue here to whoever is going to take the lead on that.
Thanks, Mick. I think I'm on board to kick off the discussion, and then of course with Hannah's help and your help to move it along. But I'm just going to ask everybody just to take a minute and think about your values. What are those non-negotiables that before you make a decision or take an action that you filter through, and like, if it doesn't reconcile with this belief or this value, then I know it's not the right thing. So where we arrived with this value discussion was, throughout our conversations, there were some themes that were rising to the top, and these shouldn't be recommendations. These aren't things that we should be doing one-off or whatever. These should be the lens, these non-negotiables, that if we're not filtering our decisions and our actions through these values, then should we really be doing these to further housing? So where to make things more concise, we landed at 4 values, but these 4 values, that's what we're here today, is to discuss these and give language and give firm statements to, these are our beliefs, these are our values, that whatever these recommendations are, they're going to accomplish these 4 things. So one is absolutely around racial equity, and that's what we need to define what that racial equity means. Innovation and access, and that's not just innovation in what types of housing we're doing, but also how we're layering tools, how we're doing things differently. I mean, come on, everybody's here. You've all been in some kind of housing planning process in the past. What do we need to do different to move this needle? Connected. It's connecting people to, there's a systems approach. There's connecting people to opportunities. They're connecting neighbors to neighbors. And then, of course, there's resiliency. We've unfortunately seen firsthand the impacts of natural disasters back to back to back. We've seen, of course, a pandemic with the economic implications of that, but we also see economic pressures that come from the city's prosperity. So what can we do to, what is that resiliency value that whatever we're moving and planning to do, or whatever we're preserving, how are we making sure that we're a more resilient community? So that's where we're going to start with that's what I wanted to lead in with, is just get us to thinking about these are our non-negotiables. And Marshall, I'm just going to tell you, some of your emails and conversations, these have just sat really, really, they've hit me in the heart. I wanted to make sure when we've had these meetings with the planning session that, and everyone else's comments around, especially around equity and about our neighbors, and making sure that we respect that every person's different, every neighborhood's different. We need to make sure that that's what we are actually getting down to, is we're helping people. This is people centric. And so, Hannah, I don't know if you want to go from here and start working us through what some definitions were that we talked about, or some concepts. I'm here to help out with this whole conversation.
That's been so great, Angie. Thank you. So we'll have 2 pieces to this. The first is, like Angie referenced, we want bold statements for each of these 4. These are sort of placeholders because we didn't want to flesh this out too much. We want to capture what you all think. So what kind of language needs to be included in a bold statement about each of these values? And then Kia on the other subcommittee was referencing having questions that we ask ourselves, because you can look at a statement and think, yeah, I'm doing a great job at that. But what questions specifically with each of these values could we include as an educational tool, as a reference, to get people to a level of specificity, either about their investment, about the development they're proposing, about the policy that the city's looking at? So for example, Kia had the question, when you're developing something, she's talking to a developer, do you have space so that the people who live around that development can come and sort of be part of that space? What is the accessibility like for the whole community? So I think those kind of questions help take it from the bold statement, which we want, into a level of, sort of directive tools that we can be able to say, not only do you get to sort of say, yeah, I believe that, but how are you answering each of these questions? So with you all being, the experts, the people on the ground, what are some questions? And you can, do you guys have chat capacity on this one?
Typically, we haven't on these
okay.
calls.
Okay. Well, then I will send out an email to you all. But during this question, just be thinking about those, and we'll capture those after we get off of this call. But what are some questions, as you see developments going on around town, or you're in meetings that you think, man, it doesn't seem like that person asked them this question. So we'd like to include some of those questions with each of these values, but for the remainder of this meeting, we'll start with the defining of these terms. So for racial equity, I know we've had a broad conversation. I think Ed was sharing about, we know that there's fair housing, there's discrimination ongoing in housing that affects many people, many marginalized people, but we also know that there's specific racial redlining specific policies that were intended to keep Black people out of homeownership and out of specific neighborhoods for wealth generation. And so I think something that's come up is how we can be specific in our language so that then it forces us to be specific in the tools that we develop and the investments that we make. So I will open up racial equity at this time, and what I'll do is just sort of capture notes and again go back and then wordsmith and try to incorporate what the discussion reflects.
So I'll lead in with the racial equity with a point I think that needs to be made that needs to be super clear. Affordable housing is not fair housing. Just because we create or we preserve affordable housing does not necessarily mean that it creates access for populations that have not been able to benefit from these opportunities. So there's that intentionality that not only do we need to have those physical units available, but there are also additional barriers that need to be overcome for them to be able to access it or stay in the housing.
Man, y'all are quiet. You know this is a good topic to talk about, and everybody's being quiet about this. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in without some others. When I think about racial equity, I think about it both as an outcome and a process. You know, what outcome are we ultimately trying to achieve by this, where that we're ensuring that no matter what one's race is based on, you know, their social economic outcome, that there is something that is driving that we're trying to achieve to help in that matter. And then from a process standpoint, you know, we apply racial equity when those most impacted by a structural racial inequality are meaningful and involve the creation and implementation of that institution's policies and practices that impact the lives of people from a racial standpoint. So when we have to define what the outcome is and also what is the process to ensure that there is racial equity. And those processes oftentimes are dictated by policies and practices. So how do we lead with outcome and process to ensure that there is racial equity?
That's great. Thank you. Licia, I see that you came on camera. Are you going to share with us? You're on mute.
Should we go to Councilmember Allen? Wow. And then come back to Lethea?
She can interrupt me when she gets her thing going again. This may be more of a question than a statement. It's so easy to me to look at past structural policies and know exactly what they are, like redlining and just government programs that concentrated people by race. I have a harder time knowing and being aware of what is in place now that I need to be working to dismantle. And that's, I mean, I think that's more than we can put in this sentence, but I mean, I think there are a lot of people who suffer from that same kind of just unawareness. You know, what is it that we need to be pulling apart here? So is there a way to somehow in this sentence, without turning it into a book, just be slightly more specific about, you know, are we just coasting on terrible policies that The Color of Law, which is such a great book, you know, has clearly identified the government caused this problem and now the government needs to solve it. Are there things that we still need to be dealing with at the metro level that we can call out here in a word or two, or you know, or are we just still coasting, and are there specific, again, in not in something that's a whole book, but you know, are there specific things we can say we should be doing just to re-level the playing field and give everyone, you know, sort of bring the an entire community that had the past stacked against them, you know, up to the same starting place that you know, that the WASP and the group have been on for forever. So I mean, it's a complicated question, but I feel like there are a lot of well-intentioned people that are just clueless on what it is we need to fix. And can we get slightly more specific in that in Marshall's challenge to us to give us more tools to understand what we're trying to do? So that's not a helpful statement, but it's an impassioned question.
Hello, this is Lethea. I think I was double muted and did not realize it. But to the council lady's question, what we see from a banking perspective is just having a more diverse team in looking at various applications. And so when you have a more diverse team, then there's more understanding of different cultures. And so that can affect how the housing situation is addressed. Because Diane Sawyer actually has a segment on NPR, and it just discusses appraisal bias. And so there was one couple, they were a mixed couple, and the wife was black, the husband was white. And so when the appraisal showed up, the wife was there who was black, and the appraisal came back very low. And so they had it redone, and they were advised to, you know, remove certain things from the home. And on that occasion, her husband was there, who was white, when the appraiser came back, and the house value went up $100,000. And so that segment is actually on NPR. So when you think about it, that's just equity and money and wealth building that affects black families. And so, again, the way we are looking at addressing that is having more diverse appraisers, more diverse, you know, mortgage people, so that they understand some of the biases that are unintentional but happen.
This is Dan, and let me give you a thought or two. Can you hear me? Okay. I think the term, we need to talk more about housing for all income level, and you hear me often refer to affordable housing. I mean, not affordable housing, but mixed income housing. And I think there's the general concept out there that when you say affordable housing, many people relate that to people who have low income. And I think that in general, when you look at the statistic, there's a big gap in terms of income among Black or brown people and white people. So that when we say affordable housing, people tend to think that, okay, here we go, public housing, we don't want that in our neighborhood. Whereas we need to start talking about we need housing for all income levels. And you try to get away from the thinking or the imprinting in people's mind that affordable is low income, and low income mean Black and brown people. So let's talk about, we need to have housing for all income levels. That's a thought. I think that it's something that Bucky, that is out there, and we can't change people's perception and how they've been imprinted, but we can maybe try to talk in try to avoid use of certain words that create certain images in people's mind.
I have something to add. May I talk?
Please do.
Okay. Yes, just adding to what Council Allen says, because I have lived that and I see that Hispanic live that situation too, wherever they go, is that bias that when people apply for a loan, they immediately think, oh, he has to be illegal. He cannot qualify for a loan. And, like to have more diversity and people with more education about different status that allowed immigrants to buy houses, not immediately discriminate and said he may not qualify for a loan because he is Hispanic, for example. If we have more diversity in the mortgage companies and in all the institutions related with housing, that will be ideal.
Yes, that's really helpful because, like you said, Eduvina, we know the statistics on that, where what you and Lethea shared, it's well documented, and those stories, I think, help illustrate it, like what Lethea shared, and we know that there's examples of similar things happening with loans with people where their status is assumed. They don't even get the chance to, be able to outline actually what their status is. So do you feel like the representation at the staff level is captures what you're saying, or is there additional language that I should add?
I think that represents that, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Eddie, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, yeah, I do. Okay, I got a question about this values thing. Are these the values without anything behind it? Does that mean these are the values that we on the task force already embrace and practice? Does that mean the values that we on the task force need to adapt and live out? Is that the values that the city must have in order for these recommendations to be reached? I'm a little confused over whose values we're talking about, because I don't see anybody on this committee who doesn't value and practice racial equity. I don't see anybody on this committee that doesn't value and practice innovation and access. And that's sort of what my question's coming from. I feel like we embrace these, but let's take racial equity. The problem has never been, it's always been at the banking and federal and government level. It has never been in the for-profit development level. It has never been a nonprofit level. It has never been at the advocacy level. It has never been at the level that most of us live and work, at the academic level. So that's why I'm just sort of curious. What do we mean there? Thank you.
I'm happy to start, Hannah and Mick, if you want to follow up. But so Eddie, for me, it's these recommendations that we're putting forth for the task force. Fund the Barnes Fund, do these various tasks. Sometimes when we award funds for affordable housing, whether it's home or barns or whatever, there's criteria in RFPs, but how intentional in that language are we getting when we issue those funding opportunities that, you know, we need to make these strong efforts to make sure that African Americans, people, you know, with limited English proficiencies, that we really need to deepen our efforts, that whatever outcome from these funding opportunities that we use the Barnes Fund for or other resources, achieve that racial equity. And that's one of the one of the values that we need to be looking at, that just really brings that to the top of the funding opportunity. So that's one example that I was thinking, that I thought of as you were asking this question. I'm glad to pass it on to Mick or Hannah to add on to that.
I would just jump in and say, I think these are not necessarily trying to represent what the task force values, for lack of, it's not quite the right framing, but I think the purpose of these values is sort of say, when folks like the mayor or the Housing Trust Fund Commission, the Barnes commissioners are figuring out how they want to spend this, hopefully, let's say $30 million of Barnes funding next year, they have a number of different ways that they could think about how to make these investments. And what we're seeing is, you know, throughout these last 3 months, it's come up again and again. Hey, let's not forget this city and this country has had a well-trodden history of racial discrimination throughout housing policies. And I'll go as far to say, I think they've happened at all levels, from the individuals to local folks to developers, and all the way up. You know, well-meaning folks have not always had well-meaning impacts, or the impacts have not always been great, especially from a racial equity lens. So my thought would be like, this is kind of glib, but I also think it's kind of true, is there's room for improvement for all of us in regards to this. So that's how I would think about it, rather than it being out there and someone else has sort of done this. It's sort of, we all have a shared responsibility to do it. So I think what these values try and get at is a lot of what we've discussed that hasn't explicitly made it into the recommendations, but the task force would be disappointed if the recommendations were implemented in such a way that didn't reflect these values. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered the question, is that these are the values that we feel like the community needs to embrace, and that the task force, or whatever the residue of it, to oversee this plan, needs to ensure that gets enforced. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, like these are sort of guiding principles for the implementation of the recommendations.
All right, thanks, Mick, that helps.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Eddie. And I will say, I really value these because it helps, like Angie was saying, you know, we can have the Barnes Fund and we can have mechanics, but beyond mechanics, where are we headed? You know, and we want to count units and all of those things, but there are some things that maybe aren't specifically quantifiable. But I certainly, in the last year, have had a brand new appreciation for resiliency and how we're weathering, natural disasters and what kind of systems we have set up. And right now, you can go through the motions with Barnes, and it's really important work. But without these sort of things that we're constantly flagging at every step of the way, it can be easy to get lost in the mechanics. And so I think, these sort of directional, notes that you're giving to the city, to partners, to people who want to come here, this is the chance to say, not only do we have recommendations about what we want to do, but here's how Nashville's housing community operates, and here's what we want to see. Here's our best self. So I do want to make sure we get to all four. Is there additional language? I also want to make sure everyone's had a chance to speak on this one who wants to. Jeremy?
Can I just ask a quick question based on what Eddie was talking about? So these values, we're going to note these. These are the values of how you're going to look at these recommendations going forward. But what I'm asking is that then we do that. Shouldn't these been the values that we should have been looking at it as we were thinking about the recommendations?
I would, I think that that's how, I think I would say that it's more the latter, that these values informed. I may be trying to read people's minds, which I shouldn't do. These inform some of the decisions that were made, but I do think these went into what was in the recommendations, but aren't necessarily explicit within them. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, and what I was just trying to understand is that as you were doing the tabulations and saying that these were the highest recommendations that were noted here, there was some values that were taken in consideration as informing what are the highest recommendations. And so it just seems like if we're putting these values on the back end, what we're saying to, based on the recommendations, it seems to me that we're saying keep these things in mind as we go to implementation of recommendations, more so than it was these were the values we considered when we were coming up with these recommendations.
Yeah, isn't it both?
Well, I think that's what I'm asking. Did everybody look at all these recommendations through a racial equity lens, through an innovation and access perspective? I mean, were we looking at it, can I personally say, was I looking at it from all four of these without clearly knowing how they're being defined? And I think that's what Eddie is getting to a little bit of is, did we all buy into all of this as we were thinking about putting forth recommendations and as we were identifying what was laid out for us through these four lenses? So all I'm saying is that we need to, as we're putting this forth, we're saying something to the effect that as we implement these recommendations, these are the values that we will take into consideration. So I think these are on from the standpoint of implementation than it was, the beforehand. At the conclusion of all of this, this is how we're going to look at implementing this. So I just thought that just needed a little clarity to there in my mind. Maybe I'm off a little bit.
No, I agree, Marshall. I think, and we could have probably flipped it. I think you could do it either way. But these were sort of the things that came up through the conversation that sort of, to Angie's point, they're not a specific mechanical recommendation because you can't check off. It's really, what are the things that we want whoever's working on this policy, tool, investment, whatever, think about these four things and ask yourself some questions for each of these.
So and that's what I was getting clarity on is this, okay, as we look at these recommendations and we start implementing, let's look at it through these values, statements that we have here as we're moving forward into this. So that's all I was looking for.
Yeah, and that's helpful because then I can make sure the report frames that we didn't start with these values and then say, what are our recommendations based on that? We said, here's a lens through which all of these recommendations should be viewed for implementation. Thank you.
And I'll just say one more thing. I know we need to keep on moving about the racial equity piece of it all is, for me, I'm always inclined to make, and this sort of gets at Councilmember Allen's point earlier, and I think she's seen something else I've put together when we were talking about racial equity lens, is I always feel like it's helpful to point out previous shortcomings in order to put context around what the future should look like. We know we need to do better because of what happened in the past specifically, and about maybe citing, and we talked on our phone call yesterday, planning is, I think Angie suggested having the Nashville redlining map as an exhibit as part of all this, and that can just be off to the side where this racial equity would be like, this is what helped shape Nashville today was a racist housing policy, and being explicit about that, because that gives us a jumping off point to be even more active about pursuing better housing policies in the future. I just like the idea of acknowledging the past explicitly as part of, especially when it comes to the racial equity piece, because that's why, that sort of, I think it helps.
And can I just add really quick? And you're absolutely right about that, from a simple fact that we all know that neighborhoods, the racial composition of neighborhoods didn't just happen on their own, where everybody says, hey, I want to live here.
Yeah.
It was definitely very targeted. Whether or not neighborhoods had decent housing, good schools, well-paying jobs, and all of those things. A lot of this is driven by policies, procedures, and the people that are in the room. And we have to speak to making sure that we're intentional about changing policies, procedures, and the people in the room to ensure that those neighborhoods and the aspect of those neighborhoods change drastically, because that's the only way that affordable housing becomes more distinct and more valued through everybody.
That's really helpful. So I think, as you've seen, I've just sort of captured notes here, but I've certainly heard themes about framing the past and being aware of what we might not even know that we're currently doing, to Council Lady Allen's point, trying to suss those things out and not taking a framework that, we're all better now. That the representation of who's in a room, who's making decisions, really matters, and that the intentionality that we saw in racist practices in the past has to be not just matched by current intentionality, but exceeded. We have to go above and beyond to be intentional in the way our policies address the past. So hopefully I've captured that. If there's other things that come to your mind that after this conversation, always email me. For innovation and access, do you want to frame this one, Angie? I think you did a good job talking about how are we doing, not just what are we building for the future in terms of sticks and bricks or 3D printing or whatever form that takes, but how are we in our planning, our zoning, our funding, our systems ready to see the future of housing? So I think that's really helpful, of course, from a policy standpoint, not just thinking about our current state, but what does our future state look like and how are we going to be flexible to absorb that? And then I think there's a lot of things that have come up on layering, being agile, flexible, creative, which I know housing funding is not traditionally those things. So anything you want to add there to frame the conversation, Angie?
Yeah, you did a great job. But this is the part where we're getting, we're coalescing around the idea of that foundation and that capacity building from multiple directions, where through a systematic approach, through wherever that would land within Metro or wherever on building that coordinated housing systems approach, but then the innovative ways we can address housing needs to create opportunities for neighborhoods and citizens, as well as different technologies. So this is a multi-layered one that reflects these conversations we've been having around that whole deep need for capacity at a sustained and consistent level that's accountable. I would add that in this piece here. This is one. So that's where our discussions were around. So then we'll just open it up to you guys to hear some thoughts or take questions to clarify that one. And Mick, did you have any thoughts on that?
Not anything that will improve upon what you just said. I think you nailed it. John, I see your hands up.
Yeah, maybe it belongs somewhere else, but is part of this the notion that we are pursuing this with the idea of being a leader in the nation in dealing with the affordable housing crisis? That we're not seeking to be a laggard. We're not seeking to be in the middle. We're really, Nashville's worthy of an affordable housing practice, an affordable housing plan, an affordable housing effort that positions the city as one of the best in the nation at addressing this problem.
John, I love that. I love that bold statement of we are going to be a leader in the nation on addressing this. I think that needs to be absolutely reflected. Yay, John, love it.
Just a second, Angie. I absolutely love it too. That was awesome. You just beat me to it, but I think that's such a great way of leading.
I'm being awful chatty today. I don't know what's gotten into me.
I love it.
I apologize with that. So help me understand the word access here, Angie, just a little bit more about, I get the innovation piece of it, but help me understand a little bit around the access component of it.
Thanks, Marshall, because I'm glad you brought that up. When we were in our talking in our co-chairs meeting, we realized that access wasn't really reflected in any place in a real way. There might be some recommendations about it. So this is where, at least from my remembrance, and Hannah and Mick, I can't remember if you were in that meeting, where we ended up putting it was not just creating a system, but making a system that is accessible for everyone.
I think Ed was the one who added that, and that's certainly where I see a lot of opportunity with innovation. There's a lot of tools being developed, technologies, in order to, make it simpler for people to find housing, especially subsidized housing. And we know funding's really, caused applications and everything to be very segmented and makes it really hard on people. Everyone on this call knows that, but what can we do to make sure that we sort of leapfrog some of the challenges, and if there's a technology solution that allows us to streamline that access? Ed, did you want to speak to that as well?
Well, and I think you did a fantastic job. I felt that it needed to be present in the values, largely because I think a lot of times when people think about innovation, they always think about moving forward and creative and new ways to do things. But I feel like a lot of times what's forgotten is that you can and should bring people along, right? And so the access to say, if we create a new wheel, can everyone benefit from it? And how do you integrate them into the process as well as into the benefits? I think a lot of that kind of was picked up a little bit in our racial equity conversation, but I think this is more in line with how do we create these tools and then make sure that people are accessing. How do we create these tools where people have their certain level of involvement, and then also how are they tools built that have access in mind? I mean, we're all living in a virtual world now that allows us unprecedented amounts of contact and communication. So we kind of start to lose some of the excuses we've had in the past. So now we just need to be intentional, and that's really what it's about.
Do you think that there's a better word, Marshall? Because I do think I'm really hearing like a people anchor in this, especially with what Ed said. And I think it, reminds me that sometimes you can get lost in the innovation cycle and forget what the point is. And that, I think Ed said it so well, that this is about people, that where we're using creativity, is it to improve people's lives, or are we sort of just getting stuck in, oh, this is some cool new thing, and sort of making sure we're not getting away from the purpose that doing things in a new way is not for its own sake, but it's for the sake of impact for Nashvillians.
Yeah, I would just say, I know access and accessibility are one and the same, but people don't look at them as one and the same. So what I mean by that is that not everybody believes they have the same accessibility to the Barnes Fund across the board. I mean, nonprofit developers are saying, I don't have that same access as the nonprofits have to the Barnes Fund. Along the racial lines, some say, hey, I don't have that. Size of organizations say, I don't have that same. So when I'm thinking about access and accessibility, I'm also thinking about the equity part of this as well. So what I do like is the natural flow from racial equity to accessibility and innovation and how these things are flowing. So that's all I was asking. I didn't know if access meant, products, services, resources, but it's just a matter of defining. I think Ed has done a good job in outlining that, but the accessibility really gets to what I think is really core to a lot of that.
That's really helpful. I'm going to make a note of that once I find out how to spell accessibility in a way that's not embarrassing in this public setting. And for the sake of time, I do want to make sure we get to connected and resilient. So I'm going to take some of the notes on things Angie said. But for connected, I know Kelsey, I'll speak for her since she's on the other subcommittee, but has definitely referenced, this is one where I think we can find the term that we think best captures it. But, obviously we want people to be able to have transit access. But I think the connectedness, like Angie was saying, in terms of not just, oh, you live along a corridor and that's all we're looking for, but what are we doing to facilitate neighborhoods, connectedness within a neighborhood? And I think that also links back to some of the NIMBYism that, when we're advocating for a development somewhere, it's not, to Dan's point, oh, these are poor people who are coming to live in your neighborhood. This is the evolution of your neighborhood and a sense of connectedness that goes beyond the units. And again, to Eddie's question about values, this isn't something, the mayor's office isn't necessarily going to go and host neighborhood parties so everyone gets to know each other, but it signals our values as a city. So I'll just frame that, but then open up for discussion as I take notes.
And let me add before we take any questions, it's almost two-pronged. There's connectedness to create where it doesn't exist, and we want to be making sure we're creating opportunities that connect to jobs, healthcare, childcare, schools, all those important things. But there's the connectedness that we don't want disrupted either. There are communities with deep roots, with close ties where that has been disrupted through some housing activities or economic development activities. So I think that's also something we need to be mindful of as we're addressing these housing needs, is what can we create where it doesn't exist, but what do we need to be mindful of that could tear a neighborhood or a community apart.
That's helpful. I'm trying to find words for that, but keep discussing.
I mean, it seems to me like I couldn't figure out what this meant, but now you're saying it's connected to jobs and opportunity and connection to community. That's the other prong, it sounds like.
Any other thoughts or comments? John, is your hand up for this one, or is that from the last time?
Yeah, my hand's up. Something's been on my mind, and I'll take this opportunity to introduce the idea. Is I think it's going to be really important that we just, we've got this fabulous plan and the priorities are right and all this stuff, and it's going to be, sensitive to race and racial equity and innovative, and we're going to be leaders. But when it all boils down, this is about people and it's about stories. And it seems like one way that we collectively, this task force, the mayor, and everyone involved in the solving the housing problem, really needs to be engaged in a campaign to educate our stakeholders and public about the stories of real people living in this crisis. And that's a form of connection.
Did you have another comment, John, or
No, I'm good.
Which was great. I'm still living on the coattails of your leader in the nation on innovation. Marshall, any thoughts? I see those wheels turning. You're right. You're one of the fit folks across my ribbon at the top. So, or anybody else that we haven't heard from about being connected before we move on to resiliency.
Yeah, I say we jump onto resiliency, and if anyone thinks of things or didn't get to share anything today, shoot it to us via email after this call, or join us tonight at 5 p.m. As well as is the other option too. But I know we're getting short on time here, so Angie, take it away.
Have to get I'm on two monitors, one with my notes, one with the screen, and I couldn't find my mouse. So finally with, and resiliency is really important for me, because seeing and working on programs through the 2010 flood, tornadoes, then recent floods. So there's the resiliency on how are we helping with our housing stock to be more prepared or to respond to it, but also what are we doing to help our neighbors prepare for economic pressures that come their way? And there's, this is where there's so many tools that we do have in our toolbox that sometimes we don't think of as helping with resiliency, but that's really what we should be thinking of, is what helps people stay in their homes when these things happen, or become less at risk of losing their homes, or being able to return as quickly as possible. So that's where it really elevates for me with resiliency. And Hannah or Mick, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
While folks are thinking, I will use this as a chance to shout out an recent example of resiliency with THDA. We were awarded the Rebuild and Repair grant for the tornado, and as many of you know, there was very little flood coverage in terms of a lot of people uninsured. And so THDA is working with us to transition that grant from tornado repair to where a lot of folks were insured, to the flood repair and rebuild. And so I was just so impressed with that sort of responsiveness by the THDA team. We asked if we could transition it, and I expected a no, because I thought of Barnes funds and thought we don't really have that flexibility. And so was so grateful when they said, yeah, let's see if we can. So that was a real example to me of what are we doing to not just say, oh, sorry, you can't, because we've always done it this way. And so thinking of how are we sort of making sure that we're a flexible, I think of almost like a trampoline, so that as a request comes, we're not just a concrete block that says, nope, rigid, but that we have some give in our systems to respond to a dynamic system. So kudos to you all at THDA, Jeremy. Any thoughts that come up for people there? I know we are right at time, so I've just captured some stuff here. I'm going to send these out to you as well. Thank you, Marshall.
I would just say, some key words that probably make a lot of sense as we're thinking about the work that we have done. I would say is the sustained ability of a community to use available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from. So that's when we were thinking about resiliency and around the Housing Resiliency Fund. Those were some of the terms that, we were thinking about. What is the sustaining ability to utilize available resources to respond, withstand, and recover from? And I think some of those adjectives get us to where we want to be when we're talking about resiliency.
That's really helpful language. And I think impactful, because you're right, it's not just, okay, one off, but what are we doing to build it for the long term?
That was going to be my suggestion. I know it's really tempting after disasters to have the stand up of a one type thing for that one event because it's emotional, but it's so much more impactful to have a steady, constant, even if it's a lower intensity funding source that can do those things over time that make it so that when something happens, it's less impactful on the people that live in that community. Whether it's, upgrading storm drains, it doesn't seem very sexy, but if it keeps the creek from dumping into your backyard and flooding your house, then that's a huge improvement that can be made years in advance before it's needed. And most cities and communities know where those flood prone areas are. There's sometimes it's just a matter of that's where the water goes. So either it's keeping people out of those areas or putting place rules for those areas that require elevations, other kind of things. And if you have a funding mechanism that's constantly available to do that kind of remedial work, it makes a huge difference. Because when it gets to the point where somebody's been impacted, they can get into a desperate spiral where the flood hit them, they don't have insurance, they can't repair their home, they have to either abandon it, which causes problems for the city, or they try to repair it and then they get hit again the next year or the year after that. And you end up trying to find a way to solve the problem by doing a buyout, for example. And that's tough because that kind of money does not come along. The 2010 was pretty unusual for the amount of buyouts that the city was able to do. And they haven't seen that level of funding since then.
I also think there's a measure of economic resiliency, financial literacy programs, robust homebuyer counseling. That's not just one time, but maybe ongoing. So there are some other things there that can help, with
Even
the
if you
economic
did something,
pressures.
even if you did something that was like, for example, a tax break for citizens who kept flood insurance on their properties, or things like that, that might be an incentive the city could put forth that would help mitigate against those future disasters. Because what we find is people don't have insurance. And I think we're going to see a huge increase in the cost of insurance in the flood zones. And that's just the natural course of that. But that means it's going to be less people the next disaster who have insurance.
Well, I would welcome, I'll send these forward to you, and I welcome and request some more specific questions like this back that we can be sharing with people, again, as an education tool, to be able to think through whether it's a policymaker, whether it's a developer, investor, what are some questions that we need to be asking ourselves to take these values, take these bold statements, and make sure that we're using them as a lens to review all of our actions. So I've kept you 5 minutes over. I really value your time. I'm so grateful today for a really dynamic discussion. This has been really important for the way that this report reflects all of the hard work that you all have put in beyond just the recommendations, the really important conversations we've had about where we're going as a city. So I'm very grateful to see your faces and that you participated so vibrantly. Again, as a reminder, next week, 5 p.m., I'll send out a calendar invite, which will be followed by the WebEx invitation as a panelist. And that will be our chance to wrap up and be together one last time. Anything else, Mick or Angie?
No, thanks everybody. Appreciate all your time.
Thank you all.
Thank you guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.